So what do you need to consider when you are developing your research questions and subsequently designing your study? So your research questions, first of all, your research must be ethical. So some research questions may be very difficult to answer without exceeding the limits of what is considered ethical conduct. Your research questions also must be testable. So there's no practical sense in asking questions that can't be tested in a way that answers the question or is even practical to do so given budget constraints. Be aware of these constraints and aim to work within your limits. Consider time, resources, and the ability to recruit participants. Research must also be within your capabilities. If your data analysis is going to require statistical techniques that are well beyond your level of knowledge or not be easily attained, you may need to consider a simpler design or data analysis plan. Ask yourself what you're trying to achieve with this research. Always be clear about the aims and scope of your project. Research must also build on existing knowledge, which relies on a good literature review to begin with. Remember that good research often tests theory. Good research also has a clear purpose and rationale. So let's now look at types of research design. So two common quantitative research designs are experimental and correlational. So experimental designs allow you to assess cause and effect, whereas correlational designs will focus on the relationships between variables. So due to the nature of the data collected in correlational designs, causation can't be inferred. Nonetheless, there is still value in this approach depending on the type of question that you're attempting to answer. Now, exploratory research doesn't usually have hypotheses. It doesn't involve testing hypotheses and can often be qualitative in nature. So let's talk a bit more about these specific types. So experimental designs typically involve measuring group differences on some dependent variable. So we might have an independent variable that is manipulated by the experimenter, and that's often referred to as a treatment or experimental condition, and we randomly assign participants to one of the conditions, and we measure the dependent variable after they have been presented with the treatment. So they may have been presented with, if we're doing research in persuasion, we may have given 3 different groups different persuasive messages, and we want to see which persuasive message works best, which has persuaded people the most. So we'll measure the level of persuasion, and we have and that's the DV, and as experimenters, we have manipulated the IV, the independent variable, which is the type of message that they received. A quasi-experimental design is similar in nature, but the participants aren't randomly assigned to experimental groups, and they're instead grouped on the basis of some existing difference. So it might be a cutoff score on some measure, it might be something like gender, or something like that. So correlational designs, what we normally do is we get participants in a correlational design, we get participants to maybe complete a questionnaire, which will have sets of questions, and they will be scales, which will be measuring certain variables. The researcher may make predictions about the direction and the strength and the nature of the relationships between the variables that are being measured. So this is often done, it can be certainly longitudinal, it can be single time point, but what we're doing there, we're not giving them some sort of treatment, we're merely asking participants to self-report on a bunch of different measurements, and then we're correlating those measurements statistically. So the experimenter is not manipulating any independent variables in the traditional sense like they would be in an experimental design. So let's now quickly talk about sample size. So sample size is really important to get a reasonable effect in your statistical analysis. So you need to have adequate sample size to achieve this. How do we know what an adequate sample size is? Well, we conduct what are called power calculations, and they should be undertaken to determine what this adequate sample size is. Now, this should be done prior to data collection, of course, because you will need to know how many participants you need to recruit. It might not be practical to recruit the number of participants that you need, so you may therefore need to reconsider your study design. And your supervisor will, of course, help you with any power calculations and any other aspects of the research design that I have discussed in this video. And you can also find more information on the concept of power on pages 84 and 85 of Field in the 2018 5th edition.